It's been 10 years since the release of Undertale, yet its impact on gaming continues to be visible through its music, characters, and fanbase. While there is no direct sequel to the game, there is an indirect continuation in its successor, Deltarune. In both games, we can see that the creator Toby is incredibly interested in investigating dynamics of power in video game narratives. My analysis of Undertale is approaching it as a decolonialist narrative.
Yeah.
Undertale is a meta game taking a critical look on how RPG mechanics encourage violence through rewarding it. The game actively pushes players towards non-violence through both story and gameplay, and even marketing for the game. Despite the power you possess, you are asked to empathize with enemies who do attack you through the act mechanic, an alternative to the traditional fight mechanic that allows you to explore and get to know the monsters who live underground. Undertale isn't like most games. It's conscious of the oppression and power dynamics that exist within gaming worlds. Traditionally in games, they encourage players to embrace colonialist mindsets. When players arrive in new worlds, they take claim to them. What is really important to the player is staying alive, long enough to explore, conquer, and colonize the space of the game world. Often, game spaces are explicitly colonial. Unsettled or abandoned territory, tropical islands, unpopulated medieval or fantasy landscapes, deep space, and the challenges faced by players are directly related to the taming of the game space's wildness. They travel throughout the world and take control of seemingly once wild environments in front of them. Even if people do show up in these worlds, they are assigned as bystanders in their own lands, while we, the players, are active participants in the worlds that they live in. If they are resistant against the player, they are positioned as enemies. In most games, you use violence to resolve conflicts with enemies and monsters. So, what is Undertale saying by providing an alternative method of conflict resolution? In Undertale, monsters are a displaced and oppressed people. Monsters are trapped in the underground, the place that they were forcefully relocated by humans out of fear, the same place that they are actively losing resources by the day in. They understand that the position they're in cannot work long term. They're running out of space and resources. If they don't receive 7 human souls, the survival of their people will be at stake. This puts the characters of Undertale into a moral dilemma. The continued existence of your character means that monsters will continue to suffer. You, as the player, are offered 3 possible solutions to this dilemma: your escape, which is a neutral ending, their freedom, a pacifist ending, or their destruction, genocide ending. Something incredibly important to note is, you as a human hold immense power over the monsters, within the gameplay and the power of your choices, and within the meta of the game. While monsters are mostly made out of magic, humans are mostly made out of water. Humans with their physical forms are far stronger. The player possesses far more physical capabilities than any one monster. This adds to the power imbalance that exists between the player and the monsters they encounter, on top of the systematic one established by the barrier being created. With that immense power you possess as a player, the game encourages you to be responsible with your actions. It judges you when you enact violence on others. By killing monsters increasing your LV, or level of violence, you prevent yourself from achieving the full story of the game. You're locked out of retrieving the true ending. Even with its clear preference to the pacifistic route for the player, there has been some pushback on what Undertale might be saying morally. A Steam post by a user entitled, "The more I think about the moral of the game, the worse it gets." That's the inherent problem with this game, in my opinion. Even assuming you play through the entire game as a pacifist and create a reputation for yourself, a reputation of not being a psychopath, people still try to kill you. And assuming you defend yourself, you get blamed. You get shamed as a player for making a choice during a situation that was possibly life or death. And these underworld inhabitants are almost always completely in the wrong. It doesn't matter if taking someone's soul will help set free all monster kind from, quite frankly, not that bad life underground. It doesn't justify killing someone. Most of the mobs just try to kill you because, I don't know why. I think it's because you're human, which is like blatant racism. The monsters of the underground attacking our player does not hold the same weight, vice versa. There are many powers and privileges that the player holds that the monsters just don't. Using people of color as a point of reference for marginalized people, we can see a similar criticism used against them when retaliatory violence is being discussed. All too often, debates concerning ethical and practical places of violence in revolutionary movements fixate on those radicalisms based on communities of color. That this is the case is no accident. By their very existence, race radical groups threaten two tenets of power: the stability of white supremacy and the rationale over when violence becomes a justifiable tactic. To reduce the monsters and their struggles to a simple narrative of violence is good or bad wipes Undertale of the complexities that lie inside of it. The monsters of the underground are going through and have went through an inherently violent process. They were beaten and forced away from their homes above ground in a racial order predicated on complex, at times invisible acts of violence as a means of subjugating marginalized communities. We must build more nuanced analytics that reject oversimplified binaries and moral dichotomies. Violence is broader than bullets, knives, and stones. Violence fundamentally is a form of taking that which has been or will be refused. As long as someone is losing something that he currently has and wants to keep, there is violence. Gordon arrives at this conclusion via reasoning that the colonizer faces threats of violence, the colonized is already living it. Undertale is interested in exploring the morality of traditional video game mechanics and perspectives. Traditional video game approaches to violence and power encourages players to engage in colonialist mindsets. However, Undertale urges players to deconstruct those mindsets to receive a full, true experience of the game. Deltarune is less interested in explorations of systematic injustice or decolonization. The conflicts in Deltarune are much more personal and small-scale. The game adds a new group of people to the canon. Darkeners, monsters and humans, now occupy the same social space as equals and as lighteners. Deltarune retreads traditional video game narratives, arrive to a new world, and fight to fulfill a prophecy of being saviors to this new group of people. Darkeners even actually find purpose in serving the Lighteners. They can't even exist without the Lighteners, even considering them godlike. This makes sense because, in Deltarune, the Dark World acts almost like adding another layer to the meta-analysis of the game. The Dark World works as a game world to the protagonists of Deltarune. The lines of reality and fiction are blurred between the light and dark worlds. The protagonists are able to enter and exit as they please to the world to begin new adventures. The Dark World in Chapter 1 is made to make players find parallels to the Underground from Undertale. This is especially clear through the character of Rousey. Rousey himself is essentially the character of Azrael repackaged for this new world. He constantly recites the messaging of the original game, urging players to choose peace and not violence. However, using more peaceful methods versus violence has very little effects on the story in contrast to Undertale. You aren't locked out of the full story from using more violent methods. You can't really kill the Darkener characters, and there is no genocide route to exterminate an entire group of people. Deltarune is instead interested in the dynamics of player control and in how seeking power and dominance affects interpersonal relationships. In Deltarune, the player has much less control than its predecessor. You can't decide whether characters live or die. You can't decide your protagonist's name, and it's repeated to you throughout the game how little control you have of the story in the first chapter of the game. However, in later chapters, the player begins to gain more control and power over the story. You, as the player, hold power in how you treat other characters, specifically Noelle. We can argue that Noelle is more susceptible to the player's controlling behaviors because of her personality. She's conflict avoidant, a bit insecure, and she can rationalize behaviors used against her. She tends to freeze up in these tense situations rather than expressing her feelings. She's much more likely to follow along plans made for her, even if she's uncomfortable with them. It's also implied that she already deals with an extremely controlling, unhealthy relationship with her mother. When she is captured by Chapter 2's main antagonist, Queen, she joins her, unable to speak up for herself. She becomes a pawn to her plans. Noelle is extremely vulnerable to manipulative tactics. The player is able to choose how they want to interact with Noelle, determining if they will help her become more confident or manipulating and bullying Noelle into becoming their own personal source of control. Through controlling Noelle, the player has access to the only fatal battle option in-game. The consequence of using this spell, known as Snowgrave, has long-term effects on the story of Deltarune. Noelle seems to be seriously affected by the manipulation of the character, even outside the bounds of the Dark World in their adventure. The player is able to essentially force Noelle into an abusive relationship. While the game is continuing to release chapters, we can assume that the ethics of the power of control will continue to be explored. Undertale and Deltarune show the negative effects of power-seeking behaviors on large scales and smaller scales. It compels players to assume more empathetic perspective than what is traditionally expected of them.